The Joust of Kings. Click, clack, click, clack. Surrounded by flickering witch-flame candles, Folkmortian watched the grandfather clock chime in the heart of his sanctum. The master of the bone tithe had always possessed an appreciation for timepieces. In each necropolis raised by his legions, nestled among shelves packed with scrolls and ledgers of conquest, Folkmortian made room for their reliable, ticking serenade. This was one of his newer acquisitions, wrought from thick ogre bone. Folkmortian owned many such osseous devices, and many of more traditional make also, if only to prove the superior, crisp precision of the former over the latter. Few Bonereapers understood his fascination. Xantos did, but then the old general was as much a stickler for precision as the tithe master himself. The great necromancer had never demanded his herald to dispose of the affection. Had it been ordered, Folkmortian would have done so in a moment. But even being crafted to serve the vessel of a god's will was no reason to abandon every quirk out of hand. As armoured feet thumped upon flagstones, Folkmortian turned to watch the doors to his sanctum grind open. Though his face was, as ever, a mask of sculpted bone, the tightness in Horik Vancy's posture indicated he wished to be anywhere but here. Striding across the floor of the scroll chamber, hand rested upon the pommel of a sheathed blade, the liege Cavalos attempted to disguise how lost he seemed without his steed, through prideful swagger. Still, the nod of acknowledgment he gave was genuine enough. "Hi, emissary. I thought we might play a game." When he was not booming out ultimatums, Folkmortian's voice was an abyssal, but not entirely unpleasant whisper. Calicross had once described him as sounding miserly, though the Mortarch had likely meant it as a compliment. As he spoke, the emissary gestured to the ivory table beside him, and the chair pulled in close. Vancy stared for a moment before giving a grunt. The liege circled the table and the board set upon it before sinking into the seat. The heavy sarcophagus eternally bound to Folkmortian's frame prevented him from doing likewise. Instead, he moved to stand across from his opponent, as Vancy picked up a crystalline playing piece. "You have a new set." "Originating from Ultrai, so I am told. Xantos sent them to me. The Haitian's craftsmanship is exquisite." The emissary nodded, pleased to share the knowledge. Annoyance flickered within him as Vancy merely grunted again and set the piece down. "I have never had much aptitude for King's game." It came as a surprise to some that the Ossiarchs played games. Yet, as Folkmortian saw it, his people were no mindless revenants. They were a culture, and a culture must have its pastimes. Of course, every such game was based around principles of strategy and logic. Even through their distractions, Calicross sought to hone his armies. King's Game was one such distraction. At its core lay elements taken from peace-capturing games found across the realms, discarding anything considered overly reliant on chance. It was played over a tiled, two-tiered board. What occurred on one impacted the other, and pieces could move between either at points, just with the realms and the underworlds. Different tiles possessed different attributes, representing forests, mountains, or likewise. Most notably, King's Game used a third neutral set of pieces that either player could employ to disrupt their opponent. Yet while this faction remained in play, neither side could claim victory. It was a matter of risk and reward, knowing when to alter one's plans. Only the best could time it just right. "You will be in good company then," Throckmorton said. Once he had aspired to be a commander to rival the Mortarch, yet had quickly discovered that it was neither his talent nor his passion. Still, he hoped Vensai would not go easy on him. As Nagash himself knew, though would never admit, one learned more from a well-fought defeat than they ever could from an easy victory. The emissary took the opening moves. Throckmorton could sense Vensai's surprise as he advanced his pieces upon the bottom board, in complete neglect of the upper. Though most players of King's Game espoused decisiveness as a key to victory, Throckmorton's early motions were circumspect. He probed the extremities of Vensai's territory, testing where he could stand and where he could not, committing nowhere, yet slowly closing off regions of the upper board through his positioning upon the lower. As he did so, the Tithe Master murmured, "Are your defences ready, emissary?" "In Praetorius," Throckmorton clarified, as he finished opening another cautious assault. As Vensai began his next turn, the emissary saw that he need not have worried about a simple game. The liege's plays were those of a soldier, but not without flair. Even as he launched a steady advance upon the upper board, the Ossiarch expertly organized the majority of his pieces to deal with the lower. A tight wedge of controlled aggression soon bore down on Throckmorton's more scattered resources, removing them one by one, or sending them into retreat. "You think the counterattack will come?" Even as he snorted derisively, Vensai's agitation deepened. Try as he might, he could not bring enough force to bear against Throckmorton in any single location to break him. The intricate wheeling maneuvers and frontal assaults he mounted were exemplary, yet in that lay the problem. Throckmorton's pieces flowed around Vensai's like the shrieking night winds of the Dolorum. He did not seek blunt engagement, instead closing off paths to the upper board when it was advantageous to do so, and employing them himself when it was not, changing the tempo and the centre of the conflict in time with his own whims. When he surrendered board control, it was to gain in the fracturing of Vensai's slab-like formations and the steady dwindling of his rival's patience. "You are too aggressive, Horak," Throckmorton chuckled as he assembled a knot of his pieces, now gathered on the upper board, into a defence. Predictably, Vensai's vanguard moved to swamp them, even as the Tithe Master shook his head and slipped more forces behind his enemy's advance. "The Mortarch of Grief's armies already move on Settler's Gain. Whatever the result, we would be fools to presume there will not be retaliation. Better to stand in readiness." "Let the elves try it if they like," Vensai snarled, his attention entirely upon the twin boards as he commenced his next turn. "These are our strongholds, and you have bigger things to fret over." Too late, Throckmorton saw the ploy. By surrendering the lower board prematurely, he had allowed Vensai room to prepare an initiative-stealing reversal. Pieces he had considered scattered and meandering suddenly moved as one to pass through to the upper plane, spreading their influence across tiles that the Tithe Master's calculations had deemed irrelevant. Losing ground in the face of this coordinated, intractable assault, Throckmorton's hand at last strayed towards the neutral pieces, thus far untouched. Even as he sacrificed these outliers in an effort to slow Vensai, the Tithe Master saw himself play into his opponent's hands once again. Unable to concentrate his resources in any one location, forced to fight on multiple fronts, he could only watch as Vensai swept the remainders of the unaligned forces around to bolster his already strengthened center. It was all Vogmortian could do to stifle choice angles of advance and watch as Vensai's pieces punched through his stretched defenses. "Impressive, Liege Cavalos," Vogmortian nodded as he repositioned and attempted to regain some control. "I see why you and your dread lance have earned your reputation." Vensai's reply was silence, his advance subsiding as he continued to regard the uppermost board. Long seconds dragged by, punctuated by the predictable ticking of the bone clock. Vogmortian's finger moved to tap on his staff in time with the slow noises. If there was one thing he could not stand, it was a deadline being missed. "Has your nerve failed you?" "You play a strange game, emissary," Vensai muttered, gaze not lifting. "Even now, your pieces are clustered about the mountains here. Had you abandoned it and retreated it to the lower board, returned to your lockdown strategy, you could perhaps have stymied me enough to force a stalemate. That is what I would have done." The Liege Cavalos was right. Vogmortian had not even realized it. Yet, in the back of his mind, where the whispers of the great necromancer rasped against his own thoughts, the Tithe-master suspected it had not been coincidental. Part of being a god's vessel was that it became difficult to tell where you ended and they began. "I suppose I have," he said at last, giving a nod. "They will counter and seek to humble us, so we will turn it back upon them. It will come down to the mountain, in the end." "The mountain?" "Do not be obtuse. The mountain. Some say the stone heart of Eumetrica was the first thing in creation, endless in its way. You know the master will take umbrage at such a claim. Aish will suffer for it." "If you say so, emissary, I will commit." Vensai shrugged. "Either way, your strategies have proved inadequate. I have opened you up and put you to flight. Above and below, all dances to my tune." "Does it?" Vogmortian's query was not rhetorical. Nagash's herald stared at the plain grey piece standing just a few tiles from where his crystalline hosts clashed against his rivals. Earlier, he had moved the thing up in a desperate attempt to slow Vensai, and had discounted it as lost. Yet now, through some quirk of fate, this one piece was poised to threaten the core of both forces. One decisive move either way, and the balance could swing. It was King's game at its finest, yet something about the sight sat poorly with the emissary. A sliver of information, recorded in one of his countless ledgers, boiled up unbidden. "There are mordants in Eumetrica," Vogmortian supposed, lifting the piece. "One of them names himself an emperor." "If that is all, then I do not see how there is anything for us to worry about." "Perhaps," Vogmortian nodded. It seemed an ill-fitting explanation, but then what else was there? Try as he might, the emissary could not grasp it. Murmuring wordlessly, he set the pieces down again. After a few long moments of staring, Vogmortian moved to reset the board. Contemplation only went so far. Eventually, everything simply had to be tested for true. "A draw, we shall call it. Let us go again."